Thank you all you gentlemen for the excellent presentations. And I'd like to follow up on that. I think Michelle walked around at the beginning of this session with some additional information. I think that some of which contains some of the science that you guys were talking about. For example, you'll see this 4-page brochure from our FWC Division of Marine Fisheries Management, Introduction to Marine Fisheries Management. You'll also see a Sea Grant publication, interview with Dr. Lindberg, Understanding the Ecology of Artificial Reefs, No Simple Answers. And then the third publication that we handed out is from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, a guide to fisheries science and stock assessments. And these are publications we thought that might be useful for you as you think about what we've been taught this afternoon by these guys. So please take these back and share them with your colleagues. We have additional copies back there. Furthermore, you'll see on our FWC table, I provided, I think, 7 different scientific research publications in which some of these data that they've published in the literature is there. So please stop by our FWC booth later, and you can you're welcome to as many copies of those research publications as you like. So and then one other publication we have back there is the Guidelines and Management Practices for Artificial Reef Siting, Use, Construction, and Anchoring in Southeast Florida. This is and it's kind of a best management practice guidelines document, and it contains a lot of the thoughts about developing artificial reef strategies and objectives. And there is this chapter on there on fisheries management that would be worth, and we have plenty of copies of this back there too. So thank you gentlemen for that information, and please look at these additional references. And Luiz, I appreciate you putting together this trigger question slide. I think this represents some of the questions that I think we've been hearing from our stakeholders, and perhaps we could maybe each one of you could perhaps pick one of these and answer a response, and then we could go into the audience. So I'll start with Dr. Lindberg, and maybe if you'd like, choose one of these questions, and you can provide some insight, and we'll kind of go down the listen that. Oh, and we'll have the microphone. It should already be on too.
Luiz didn't give us the answers; he just gave us the questions.
Stand over here. I don't want to touch that.
Thank you. So which question would you like addressed? So the first one, are the red snapper inhabiting the artificial reefs taken into account in the stock assessment process? Well, as Luiz explained, the fisheries dependent data is coming from the trip tickets, it's coming from the surveys, it's coming from all the landed sources from the fishery. So if it's caught from a natural reef or an artificial reef, if it's landed and intercepted in the recreational surveys, it's incorporated. If a commercial boat is fishing on an artificial reef or a natural reef, there's no discrimination between natural and artificial as a habitat source for the fish that enter the fisheries independent or fisheries dependent data, and that's the lion's share of the data that goes into the stock assessment. The fisheries independent data, is a great deal more limited, and presently, my understanding is that the fisheries independent monitoring on the shelf that's being done by FWRI, Luiz's shop, and NOAA Fisheries, is that that's primarily targeting natural habitat, right? But there are recent discussions and plans to incorporate artificial reefs as part of the sampling universe for that fisheries independent data. So while it hasn't been in the past, you can expect to see more of that in the future.
May I just jump in before Mrs. Anderson and supplement? I agree completely, wholeheartedly with Bill's answer, response there. And I just would like to add a couple of things. I made a point in looking at that biomass equation there to highlight the fact that recruitment is a way that we measure the gains to the population. And when you look at the fish spawning and the larvae and early juvenile settling, and eventually us catching those recruits, so it doesn't matter where the recruits came from. I mean, if there is higher productivity, because now we have more females around here, and they're bigger, and they're spawning more, they have to be producing more young. So we would expect, under normal situations, to have an increase in recruitment. In fishery science, and several of us use this analogy, we talk about, it's almost like accounting in a way. You have the principle, you have the interest. And spawning stock biomass is the principle here, is why you want to keep growing to generate more and more interest. And if you fish the interest and leave alone the principle, you can fish for a long time. So when we build this spawning stock biomass, we're building plans and putting in place specifically so they can increase recruitment and increase their biomass of new fish coming in and the productivity of the population.
You want me to take number two?
Mrs. Anderson.
We'll take one.
Okay, with, it's kind of between the first and second questions. When you have a stock assessment that may not, either your fisheries independent data is not including the artificial reefs, but yet maybe 90% of your catch data, your harvest data, is actually being brought in from artificial reefs. Doesn't that skew that data?
If it does, it skews the data in a way that it provides a more favorable outcome. And I'll tell you why. The landings information, the way that the model looks at landings information, is really a way to gauge the actual productivity of the stock. We don't know really what the true level of productivity is, so we use two measures. One is the landings to give us a scale, and the other one are the indices of abundance, and those give us a trend, just like what Bill showed, that those indices there give us a trend. So we actually find a way to integrate the two. And just for you to understand how the landings count, it's like, okay, you want to know if somebody is rich or poor, right? So you look at their house, you don't know what their income is. Suppose that information is not available. You look at their car, you look at their clothes, you look at their vacations, or whatever expenditures. So the expenditures here is how much more you're fishing, right? So those expenditures will tell you that for a population to be able to support this level of landings, it has to be highly productive. Otherwise, you wouldn't have supported landings this high for this long. So this is an oversimplification of how it happens, but I can tell you that it gives you a measure of scale. That if you look at someone on the road and that person is in rags, you're going to say that's not a millionaire. So the productivity is lower, and this is how we gauge that scale. If that helps you, understand. So it's not necessarily a penalty as the process is accomplished.
I think Will, if you were, yeah, Will had a question, and then we can go to Bill and Bob.
So I agree with you, Pam. I think we need to have more fishery independent samples, and I think we need to have artificial reef sample intensively as well as natural bottom. And in fact, in this round of the stock assessment, some work that Sean Powers' group, some work that my group, and some work that Doug DeVries NOAA Fisheries has done, there's an attempt being made to try to incorporate some of that information. We do hear oftentimes from constituents that fish from artificial reefs aren't being counted in the assessment. So I think there's a disconnect, and Luiz did a great job of trying to explain how the process works, is that we're not really counting any fish. We can't do a census. You know, we have a conventional system that oftentimes we can't see through very well, and it's vast. So instead, what we're doing is taking the age composition information from the fishery, and we're looking at the relative abundance of year classes moving through. And then we're scaling it, as Luiz indicated, with both fishery independent and fishery dependent indices of abundance. One of the issues we have is that the fishery dependent data tend to be quite expansive. So even if we think there's a bias because only certain age classes are targeted, the precision is very high because you have a big sample size. So you may be off in the point, but your error bars are quite narrow. In the fishery independent data, we feel more confident about how accurately they reflect the population because it was done without targeting certain areas. It was done with a random sample, but our sample sizes oftentimes are much lower. So there's this trade-off in the information between accuracy and precision. So what we need are more fishery independent samples to increase our precision for data we feel are more accurate. The last thing about this issue goes back to Bill's work. Bill shows that for very high valuable habitat, there was no trend. Basically, if you fit a line through that, it would be flat, it would have a slope of 0, versus in marginally productive habitat, there was a clear decline in gag. So in reef fishes, we have a problem that catch per unit effort indices, whether it be fishery dependent or independent, suffer, and there's something called hyperstability. So when populations go down, the index doesn't go down as fast. And when populations go up, the index doesn't go up as quickly. Well then, for artificial reefs, that's even doubly so, because they're easy to find, they're known where they are, they're easy to target, the densities are higher. So it may be that we do more sampling on artificial reefs and we just get a flat line, because we know where to go find fish. Their densities are usually fairly high, even when population abundance is low. And it may not give us any more clarity as to what the trend is at all, because when the population is doing this, artificial reefs may be flat. When the population is doing that, it may be the same thing.
Follow up on that, the graph that I showed with the higher quality and the lower quality habitat. The lower quality habitat is really in terms of the relative to the natural habitat in that experiment, is pretty much on the same scale as the naturally available rock outcroppings of the region. It's on the same kind of physical dimension as some of the more commonly occupied reef habitat for that species. So, that trend, that declining trend, tracks very nicely with what the 2009 GAG update assessment showed as a declining trend from 2005 to the end of the time series. It plots very, very closely, and we're going to be testing those results against the new benchmark assessment for GAG later this year. But I think with consideration for the quality of the habitat, we can get some pretty precise estimates from the artificial reefs, but it's not going to be the same kind of reefs you build, because those are the places that are best for fishing. Right? For fishing, you're going to want the reefs that have a high standing stock regardless. Right? But those aren't the reefs that are going to reflect the trends in stock abundance.
I just want to make a few generality comments about fishery independent and fishery dependent data. I pretty much agree with what's been said. But in addition to that, fishery independent data, I think, are certainly preferred by most scientists, because there's a much less risk of bias in fishery independent data if they're gathered properly. And as Will mentioned, in the last couple of years, we began to refocus on sampling fishery independent methods so that it's much more random and there's very little bias if if you have enough data, that's the problem, though. Getting enough data, it's very, very expensive to generate or to gather fishery independent data compared to gathering data at the dock. I certainly agree with Luiz's analogy of the rich man and the poor man, but you got to worry about the Warren Buffetts, because if you look at Warren Buffett, you would think he's a poor man. He's lived in the same house for 300 years. And that's one of the problems. That's one of the problems with relying too heavily on fishery-dependent data, and that's certainly where we're all headed, is more fishery-independent data.
I see Robert Turpin with a question.
Yeah, I agree with the sampling the recreational catch, but you're getting a catch, and really to get a better idea, you want catch per unit effort, and that's what's not part of that equation.
Yeah, you do get catch per unit effort. I mean, not specifically for the artificial reefs. Sorry, Roy, just jumped in.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. But all recreational landings data are measured according to the same survey. And so all the samples, they come from whatever, they are grouped by mode, whether they're private recreational, right, shore-based, or private boats.
Maybe I can explain what I see when I go out fishing. 5 years ago, I would go out fishing, and it would take me 6 hours to catch my two-red snapper, and I come in. Now I go out and I've caught my two-red snapper within an hour. I come in. That's the CPUE that I'm describing. So
And that-
that's one that.
Right, and that CPUE is estimated, and if you look, for example, I mean, I was in Miami a couple, 3 weeks ago for the red snapper stock assessment, where we review all this data, and you can see a real sharp increase in the actual CPUE. So it is showing, actually I had some additional slides that I had put, because I thought that, and this is really just from the old, the previous one, just to show from the old estimates of the rebuilding plan. One other misconception is that the biomass, the virgin biomass, young fish biomass, is what people are reaching towards, and that's not true. For the biological reference points, you really use some level that's determined by the council primarily, as informed by its SSC, for what constitutes the number of females, or the biomass of females they need to have there. It's like how many chickens you have for how many eggs you want to get. So it's really to that basic level. But when you see now the rebuilding plan, and Robert, what you mentioned, in terms that abundance levels seem to be increasing, and people are saying, oh my gosh, depending how long you've been fishing in the Gulf, you may not have seen this level of abundance in a long, long time. And I can tell you, the expansion that Bill exemplified with McCall's basin model, the expansion of the stock with recruits now going into the West Florida shelf. I mean, it's amazing. Like off of Tampa, it's impossible not to catch a red snapper now. I mean, the fish are relatively younger than they are up here and further west, because it's primarily new colonization through that expansion. But we can see, looking at the recreational catch per unit, an increase in catch rates, and that provides, an estimate of total biomass that's actually higher.
Yeah.
Earlier when Dr. Shipp was giving his presentation, he was talking about the historical catch of the red snapper. He showed that mostly it was in the east, around the Pensacola area, and that the artificial reefs that were made by the oil wells increased the population of the red snapper.
all the other fish. So, I mean, we do have the lionfish that are a problem, but one of the things that we're very concerned about is, like, this past summer when I went out, the red snapper were bigger than we've ever seen them before. And when you open up the stomachs of those red snappers, they're eating red snappers. So the future fish stocks that are declining, that are still in decline, are not necessarily from people putting a hook in the water. The decline in the fish stocks could be that we are protecting a species to the point that that species is actually eating its own young, and we won't have the fish stocks that we would have had if we allowed nature to take its course and not try to build an unnatural red snapper fishery in Tampa, Florida.
I don't want to be the one monopolizing. Yeah.
Candy, your first comments regarding Tampa, again, historically, Tampa, at one time in the early days of the fishery, did have significant snapper stocks. When the stocks became depleted off of Cape San Blas, the fishery moved to Tampa and then eventually to Veracruz. So the repopulation of Tampa is not really something that's unnatural. However, I certainly will agree, and I guess my colleagues don't agree with me on this one. I think that the biomass of snapper stocks in the Gulf now is far greater than it's ever been. And I think the terminology of rebuilding is a little bit misleading, because rebuilding implies that you're trying to reach a level that existed in the past. My professional belief is, because of the increased habitats in the Gulf, especially the northwestern Gulf, we far surpassed the biomass. Having said that, Magnuson mandates that we build to current productive levels. And even if I'm right, that doesn't mean I'm wrong. In other words, we still have to build up to whatever the potential is productivity in the Gulf of Mexico now. Now, other ideas have been put forth. Mine is that we have more habitat. Others believe that global warming might have an impact. The increased nutrients coming down from the Mississippi River may have an impact. We may have more recruitment from Mexico than we did in the past. So these are questions that are on the table, and in the next few years we'll probably get more definitive answers. The slide that Luiz has up there is from the 2009 assessment. I'll be really curious to see the new stock of the new benchmark where that slide is adjusted. So, you know, there's a disagreement among scientists, and I think that's a really healthy thing. And we'll just have to see in the next couple of years. You want to rebut it?
I would offer a rebuttal, but I would suggest that what you showed in the historical trends of landings in the eastern and western Gulf, it gives a good reason to raise the question, to ask the question. You know, but having posed that as a hypothesis, it's not the same as drawing it as a conclusion. And that it really is a hypothesis that could be tested against these other alternatives, such as changing environmental conditions or the change in the shrimp bycatch. And in fact, Ray Hilburn's suggested that this would be a fishery that would be ripe for playing out these alternative models with the historical data and seeing which of the hypotheses are best supported by the available data.
I want to add one other thing. Having presented the quote rosy picture, I am really, really concerned about the recruitment numbers that Will showed. The 2010 and 2011 numbers are they're a reason for grave concern, and it is true this is a long-lived fish, and if you miss it 1 or 2 year classes, it's not a terrible disaster. But well, we need to really look at those indices in the next couple of years, and hopefully they rebound to their previous levels.
The approach that Bill just advocated about doing these sort of mathematical simulations to test these potential other effects, one of the problems in the historical data is that there aren't any. You know, Bob listed a statistic that there were 2 million pounds caught in 1880. Well, there were 2 million pounds documented as catch in 1880. There weren't trip tickets in 1880. So we don't have a clear idea of how much landings actually occurred. And oftentimes in 1880, when things were reported, it was lane snapper and vermilion snapper and red snapper as one landing group. So there's a difficulty there. There's also some peculiarities about the way the surveys were done in the Western Gulf that we don't really need to get into. But it's a complex issue for sure. And the modeling approach that Bill advocated or suggested can be done. But again, if we don't have accurate information going back in time, it becomes a lot of what ifs and trying to constrain the information.
Dr. Shipp, I'm going to take the bait for that. It's not a rebuttal, but I would say,
Healthy discussion.
I would say, well, there are some other changes. You know, one is the quality of the records, and Will brought that up. What was the true level? Actually, we would be looking for higher landings back there, being indicative of higher productivity, you know, like you explained before. But fishing power has changed tremendously over time. So their ability to find fish, actually to spot where the most productive sites were, is very different. I mean, in 1880 or 1950 for that matter, compared to 2005 to 10 or 13. So it's very difficult. I still believe that that's a viable hypothesis. You know, I don't think it's very likely, but I don't think it's completely out of the realm of reality. I think that maybe red snapper productivity has increased over time, given those reefs, but I think that it's very difficult to measure as a hypothesis, and it has all these other confounding factors that make evaluation very difficult.
Back to Will.
I'm not, but Bob mentioned something in his comment about recruitment, and that the recruitment signal is worrisome, and it is. But it is for another reason. As Bob indicated, you know, red snapper are long-lived species. They have a life history, so how they go from egg to egg, which is called periodic, which means periodically they have a dominant year class that comes through. And so every few years there's this spike in recruitment for whatever reason, and that sustains the population into the future. In heavily fished populations like red snapper, what we tend to do is shave off those dominant year classes. And one thing that's so painful about management right now is that there were a couple of dominant year classes that came through in the early 2000s. And so each year when the average weight goes from 5 pounds to 6 pounds to 7 pounds, it's because of those dominant early 2000s year classes. In our data, and data from other folks conducting fishery independent sampling, the year classes that follow those early 2000 year classes don't appear to be as dominant. You put on top of that the fact that we appear to have, at least in some parts of the Gulf, recruitment failure in the years related to oil, and it becomes even a more problematic picture. So this is a species that should, in theory, be able to sustain some down year classes. The problem is we're trying to recover it. We're highly dependent on strong year classes coming through to fill it out. The striped bass example on the east coast of the U.S. is a perfect example. They put in a moratorium in the mid-'80s. 2 dominant year classes came through. Within a few years, the stock is fully recovered. Fantastic. Red snapper, we haven't seen that. If we have those early 2000 dominant year classes, we need some more. And if we fish these down to low levels and we don't have that recruitment coming behind, it's going to put us back in a bad spot again.
You know, not to be contrary, but in a way, I'm talking about recruitment. That's a note of, and I don't want to step out too much on the limb here, but during the assessment workshop, I didn't see anything about overall recruitment that was troubling. You know, that when the indices were separated by Eastern and Western Gulf, and they both seem to be showing okay results. I mean, I didn't see a downtrend in recruitment that seemed to be worrisome. To me, you know, questions to ask is, if we are really, truly being able to rebuild spawning stock biomass, and the recruitment levels seem to be flat. You know, if you look at a curve, I mean a map, a chart of the distribution of recruitment over the last 10 years, and you don't see an upward trend in the current assessment. So either we are not measuring recruitment now, right now, and they are having higher recruitment, their recruitment is spilling into habitat that we're not sampling, and they may be there, we're just not sampling them, or they are not being responsive because there is this density dependence where cannibalism in other ways, that they actually sort of do their own population control, which is another viable hypothesis. But when you think about where we are there compared to what's supposed to be a fairly minimum biomass for long-term sustainability, I cannot believe that densities are, causing this impact, the density again.
We have quite a few questions here. Let me just take a look at my watch here. We got 5 o'clock, so we are at our scheduled conclusion time. But I mean, this is certainly a very important topic that I'd like to continue on. Let's go from Alan and then over to
Okay. For Will, the decline of certain species was a big concern. Can we build hatcheries to manipulate the population of those species that are on decline, whether it be lionfish or the oyster?
And Will, if you wouldn't mind repeating that question for the internet audience.
So the question was, given the declines that have been seen in the years since the spill in certain species, could we build hatcheries or use current hatcheries to stock young fish to augment recruitment so that we could recover those? Right? Hatcheries have sort of a checkered history of success. And in my personal view, hatcheries are a great model to use, a great method to use when you have a critically endangered species at ultra low levels. But just because we can engineer a solution, like build a hatchery, there's no better example than the salmon fishers on the west coast of the U.S. where we've actually done more harm than good. Now, I know that hatcheries in Florida are being promoted and that there's going to be small regional hatcheries. And the idea is to create sort of what's called put and take fisheries, like occur with largemouth bass, or a better example would be rainbow trout in the Appalachians, where the big truck comes around 6 times a year, and for a week, trout fishing is real strong. And then after that week, you got to wait till the big truck comes around and puts the fish back in the stream again. So I think that there's probably enough natural production in the system that we wouldn't have to go to a hatchery model at this point to try to recover the populations. Lionfish, I think, are going to have more of an impact on things like red snapper or amberjack because they're going to compete for food. They're going to feed on small fishes, and even though a lionfish doesn't get very big, a little over a foot maximum, they have big mouths and they have big appetites. So they can feed on things that are, half the length of their bodies. And they're going to compete for food items for things that red snapper eat and things that eat what things that 2 levels up. So it's going to have a trophic shift. It's unlikely, given the distribution we've seen so far of lionfish, they don't really occur in the habitat that baby red snappers settle out on. It may be that eventually they do, these sort of low relief shell rubble ridges. But right now, for those big reef fishes, amberjack as young fish are up associated with sargassum. They don't settle out until they're later in their first year, much bigger than what a lionfish could eat. So I think the bigger issue with lionfish isn't going to be eating young, but competing for prey resources.
Thank you. And Pamela had a question after.
This is kind of long, but wouldn't what would that bring us to why we need to be building the artificial reefs to provide the necessary habitat for explosive rebuilding fishery? That's why we're here, right?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, if we have decreased recruitment and perhaps cannibalism, and I just would add to that, we've sampled thousands of red snapper, and we've not seen cannibalism, but we haven't. There are anecdotal stories from the East Coast that suggest it, and there's more stories in the Gulf, but in our random samples, we haven't encountered it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it just, perhaps it's not that prevalent. Maybe it is, and we haven't encountered it yet. Anyway, so the question was, given those things, can we build more reefs to enhance production in the fishery? So as far as enhancing production of fish, making them grow faster and die slower, the first thing that you have to ask is, what's the bottleneck? What's the one thing where there's a limiting factor? So if the bottleneck, in your example, is number of babies joining the population, then what we would need are more babies. So we would protect spawning stock biomass to produce more eggs, to produce more babies, and then maybe we should protect baby habitat, like closing areas to shrimp trawling. Even though BRDs, bycatch reduction devices, are in shrimp trawls, the shrimp trawl effort is down. They still kill baby red snapper, they still disturb the bottom. So you have to ask yourself and step back and say, what's the limiting factor? If the limiting factor is there's not enough adult habitat in the Gulf of Mexico, then artificial reefs would alleviate that bottleneck. But if that's not the limiting factor, then artificial reefs, they may promote catch rates, they may make fishing more efficient, both of which from a management perspective are perfectly legitimate outcomes. But we get ourselves in trouble when we start to suggest that catch equals production, because we've made catch easier in the shallow shelf, more accessible. We have electronics today that make fishing more powerful than it ever has been before. So it's, and this gets back to some of the stuff that Robert was talking about as far as CPUE, is that we have to be careful in correlating catch to production.
I actually saw quite a few hands on this side. Alan is his hand the highest.
Hey. I feel sorry for Dr. Lindberg because everybody's talking about snapper. So let's talk about grouper. I wanted to ask Dr. Lindberg what he thought about the rise of the Goliath grouper, and is that impacting any kind of gag stocks or any grouper stocks? We're getting so many Goliath grouper nowadays. Is that having an effect on the fish populations? Are the Goliaths eating more of those younger spawns? Have you seen any of that in your research at all? Thank you.
And repeat the question.
So the question is, has the increase in the Goliath grouper had any negative effect on the gag
Correct.
population in the Eastern Gulf?
Yes.
Okay. First off, the observation that it's common among fishermen that Goliath will take the grouper off the hook.
Right.
That's unequivocal. They will do that. But there's also been studies on the diet and using stable isotopes, that suggest that Goliath are primarily feeding lower in the food web than on the grouper that you're thinking is being preyed upon by the Goliath. Now, in our sampling of the 40 reefs offshore, we saw an introgression of Goliath from the south moving up that line of reefs. All right. We also saw an introgression of red snapper from the west moving into that line of reefs. All right. The interesting part was, in terms of the abundance of gag on those experimental reefs, the Goliath had no impact. Their presence or absence did not change the numbers at all for the gag occupying those very same reefs. In the case of red snapper, where the suggestion has been that they're competing with one another and one would exclude the other because it's more aggressive and so forth, there was a strong correlation between red snapper abundance and gag abundance, but it was positive. Given the low stock levels for both species, I'd suggest all that did was show that reef fish like reefs.
Thank you.
Mike Eller?
Keith, I just wanted to make an observation. You guys have knocked it out of the park today. You put together a rock star panel up there, and this whole thing is top notch, and you guys should be complimented. I've learned more today just from your panel than probably 5 of the last Gulf Council meetings I've been to, or any other kind of meeting I've been to. You guys really knocked it out of the park.
Thank you for our panel too. We really appreciate you guys making the effort. We certainly take more questions. Charlie,
this is for Dr. Lindberg. I need a little clarification. You were talking about the quality deployments of the 16 modules versus the 4. 16 is quality, but did you allude to the fact that the distance between the modules, I imagine you're talking about the clusters together. The distance between clusters was advantageous for the happiness of the gag grouper as far as population?
Yeah. We manipulate. Oh, okay. So you're asking whether the spacing, as well as the size of the patch reefs, had an effect on the gag grouper's perception of quality.
Right.
All right. So we manipulated both the patch reef size and spacing as part of the experiment, and coming to the conclusion of quality from the grouper's perspective, one of the measures we used to make that judgment was their residency time on the reefs. And there was a strong interaction between patch reef size and spacing. The residency times were greatest on the larger patch reefs that were more widely spaced. Right? When the larger patch reefs were more closely spaced, you ended up with a great deal of shelter in a small footprint, and the local density of gag was enough to reduce their numbers. So you had a shorter residency time when those large patch reefs were spaced. The smaller patch reefs at a close spacing had residency times that were about on a par as the larger patch reefs of similar spacing. So it's a density. It's a combination of finding the shelter and having too many competitors in one location. When the density gets too high, they'll move off.
Thank you.
I think I see Ed Kalakauskas.
Yeah, I'm from the North Florida, up in backyard. We're experiencing the same thing everybody else is with the snap arena. But our biggest problem is the perception we're having with the scientists that come out with their data. I sat before the South Marine Fisheries Council countless times and listened to the fishermen, talk to the councilman, Bill Crabtree, and then people up there. And the conception about their data that they present to the council is they feel blown up. I mean, the class you just given, like you said, you get it out of the park. How can this information get disseminated amongst local fishermen? Because right now, there's a clear divide between what you guys do and what the recreational fishermen do. And I'm speaking from North Florida.
That's a big issue, right?
I'm going to repeat that question.
The question is, how come there's this divide between what fishermen are suggesting is occurring versus what the stock assessment biologists and scientists are indicating their estimates are from the data? And so this is a big problem, and it's a communication problem. One way to get around it, one way to solve it is to do cooperative research. So in my lab, most of the research we do is cooperative research, in which we use commercial fishermen, we use charter boat captains predominantly to conduct our research. And so every time we leave the dock, we're learning something, they're learning something, and there's this give and take. And it's very important, I think, for both parties to engage in that conversation. A couple years ago, I taught a class that was a continuing ed class when I was at UWF called Fisheries for Fishermen. And it was a class, the focus of the class was how can fishermen and fishery scientists look at information, whether it's a catch of fish or a time series of data, and draw completely different conclusions about what's happening in the population. So it was advertised, and one scientist one fisherman signed up for it. So then he went back and rounded up his troops and said, look, this is a class, it's free, it's being taught, it's going to take you, 4 Tuesdays this month, come out and see, we'll have this discussion. And I told him if he could get 6, then I would do it, and he got 6. So actually, I told him to get 10, he got 6, and I did it anyway. So I think that's very important. I think the conversation has to occur, but it's not just that scientists are reluctant to talk about it. It has to come both ways. If we're going to learn from the conversation, it's got to be a two-way street.
Well, the number one question we get, they don't get trip tickets, they don't get look at trip tickets, or surveys going on. So, I mean, you know, you said there was communication. I'm speaking from North Florida. When our people get up there and talk to the council member and say, hey, our trip tickets never been looked at. I've never been asked to sample. I mean, what do you do there? Communication. Where is the communication gap there when people are saying, the people out there are saying these issues, that closure of snapper is putting people out of business, but nobody's asking me about it when I go out there.
And I think Luiz wanted to weigh in, and then we have a question in the back.
To that specific point, unfortunately, perhaps fortunately, because it costs a lot of money, the recreational data is collected through a survey, not a census. So we get, the state of Florida, we get about $2 million a year from the federal government to conduct the survey. And the survey, we conduct about, give or take, 50,000 interviews statewide. About 50,000. And those are just the in-person, where a clerk is right there interviewing people. And then you expand that to the population as a whole. There's a phone survey for the fishing effort, and there is the intercept survey for the... So the likelihoods that each individual person, you know, there are in Florida, believe it or not, an estimated, this is official figures that come out of NIMS and U.S. Fishing Alliance Service, there are 25 million saltwater fishing trips taking place in Florida annually, give or take a million or two. So when we conduct 50,000, that costs us $2 million a year, you can see that the sampling fraction is minuscule. And we have to ask ourselves, how much more do we want to pay? What will be the increase in precision and accuracy of the survey by increasing that sample size? So, you know, another thing that I think folks need to understand is that a lot of what you see, depending where you are, is absolutely true, and I believe you. You know, the situation in Northeast Florida, you know, and I had to pull up Bill's slide here without his authorization, but, you know, the center of abundance of South Atlantic red snapper is off of that Northeast Florida, Northeast Central Florida area there, off of Ponce Inlet and that whole New Smyrna Beach. You know, that's the center of abundance of the population as a whole. So you're down here in the basin. And what the council is trying to do is actually, you know, if the level of the population is here, they're trying to fill up, you know, to a level that now spills into what it used to be, you know, a long time ago. So they are not really, you know, the same thing happens with the northern Gulf, where the density of red snapper naturally is already high. And people get frustrated because I'm seeing a lot of fish and the catch rates are very high. The abundance indices are very high. But because you're down here, and the council is really working at a regional level and trying to fill that whole thing. So to get fish further south into the Fort Pierce area and thereabouts, red snapper used to be caught before, or the Jupiter, you know, Hope Sound area. You take a while, but you guys right there in that center of abundance are going to really, being down there, be seeing a lot of fish. You know, and those are the trade-offs that you have to go through in rebuilding a population as a whole.
I think we have a question over there.
I had a comment on that. Along those lines, there is a group doing surveys along the South Atlantic.
Right, they're at the WC is doing some surveys.
No, NOAA is also. It started in 2010. Management realized the need for a lot more red snapper data, and they're currently doing, I guess,
around 2,000 sites a year, while also doing mapping at night to find more sites. And their results have been somewhat positive over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Patrick. We have a question in the back.
Yeah, this is to Dr. Lindberg on your grouper. Would a program similar to what Moat's doing with the pompano and the stock enhancement done in the Big Bend area be effective towards like increasing populations of gag grouper?
So the question is, would
A stock
program
enhancement
of stock
program.
enhancement with the
Done in the Big Bend where
culture
the
and
grass
release,
bed. Yes.
I've got an opinion, I don't have any.
That's what I want to hear, is your opinion. I don't want a fact.
For a species like gag, personally, I don't think it would be as effective as other management options. You know, we have to look at what we consider, you know, the opportunity cost. You know, the cost of having the scale of release for a long-lived species like gag that have such a spatially distributed life history. You know, you'd have to put a lot of money into that stocking for a long time. What if those funds were put into other management options that allowed the natural reproduction of the population, you know, to really take hold? How much bang for your buck would you get for it? Now, that might not be the politically correct kind of statement to make, but I would think that would be, you know, not necessarily the right kind of species, the right kind of life history
Or something such
to
as that.
undertake that kind of project.
Robert Turpin has a
Yeah.
question, and then Chuck Moore.
And this is more of maybe an esoteric question, but assuming that the carrying capacity of the Gulf of Mexico is finite, and assuming that there was at one time a natural balance that was probably in some dynamic form, peaks and natural events, is it reasonable to assume that by a stock, species by species assessment and catch the way we're managing that we could ever achieve MSY for more than one species?
Luiz?
Of course, I think all of us will take it.
Well, I'm gonna answer it not from the management perspective, and I would say the answer is yes and no.